Hello, my creative friend. Do not forget that on Wednesdays we have bite-sized videos, a dose of inspiration to help you on your creative journey, aside from these longer form episodes on Mondays. And also, thank you very much for clicking that like button right now before you minimize the tab and get to your creative work. Now go create something amazing and enjoy the episode. Your Creative Push, episode 364.
Being a deliberate amateur is also a noble path. Don't let anybody make you feel bad for doing that.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Jonny Bloozit. Jonny is a self-described post-apocalyptic landscape cartoonist, and he comes on the show today to talk about the virtue of not going pro and being an intentional amateur. Jonny shares what brought him back to drawing after he lost his joy for music, how society equates successful art to money, but his opinion that you don't have to be a professional in order to be considered an artist. He shares why you shouldn't put too much emotion in gaining followers, why you should try to get up early in the morning to do your art, and some tips on how to do it, and what he does when he lacks motivation. He also talks about how he honed in on his style, the beauty that exists in things that are deteriorating or falling apart, and being analytical about his learning process. And finally, Jonny talks about the value of critique groups and the importance of learning the rules of art. I'm so glad that Jonny reached out to me. I'm so glad that he came on the show. And this is one of those episodes that sneaks up on you in its awesomeness, especially if you are an intentional amateur. And just one final note before we get to the conversation. I accidentally called pre-selection predetermination. Not a big deal, but just know that I goofed up and called it the wrong thing. So it's called pre-selection. You'll know what I'm talking about when it comes up. But that's it. Enjoy the episode and enjoy making your art. Jonny, welcome to Your Creative Push, my friend.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on. It's nice to meet you, and it's nice to really get to know you. And I really don't know too much about you, so can you give us a sort of backstory? Tell us how you got to this point.
Yeah, I've led kind of a weird life. I started drawing, I guess like a lot of people in grade school, because my little best friend drew and I looked up to him, so I wanted to draw as well. And then as a teenager, I got more interested in guitar, and music seemed to have more sexiness or instant gratification or whatever. And in my early 20s was playing in heavy metal bands. And then by like my mid to later 20s, the band thing started to feel like kind of a shitty second job that wasn't paying anything. Would kind of stick a pin in that and get back to that later too, because that ended up affecting the course of my life later.
Okay.
But I was a little older than the other guys in the band, and we weren't really on the same page with what we wanted out of it. And they really wanted to make a career out of it very badly. And so we ended up doing like a lot of really horrible things because they were supposed to be good for our career, which never really materialized. And by the age of 26, 27, it was like, okay, this is just, like I say, like having a shitty job that doesn't pay anything, a second job that you go to after your first job. And then at that point, I started to get more interested in motorcycles and also went back to school to finish a master's degree in mathematics. It's, kind of a violent change from, heavy metal bands to mathematics.
Violent. Violent is one way to put it, but yeah, definitely 180.
Yeah, it's like if I had a totem animal, I guess it would be the grasshopper or something. I'd just kind of jump from thing to thing. But in the music years, I wasn't really drawing at all, just like flyers for gigs or like artwork for the covers of demo tapes and stuff, but really wasn't drawing at all. When I started riding motorcycles, I got out of grad school at the age of 30. And then in the technology field, contract engineering started to be a thing. And this is an arrangement where you work on a sort of per project basis. So for 6 months, you might be working and then you're done. And your compensation for not really having any stability or benefits is that you might make as much money in 6 or 9 months as I used to make in 12. So I thought, wow, this is great, and started lining up the gigs so they'd be over in the spring, and then spend, the entire summer just crisscrossing the country on a motorcycle and doing a little writing for an online motorcycle magazine, and a lot of sports, martial arts, kettlebell lifting, longboarding, snowboarding. So in those years, anything that involved sitting still in a chair just wasn't going to happen, so I wasn't really doing any drawing then either. But then, that lasted for a good 17 years. But then when I got into my lower to mid 40s, like riding a motorcycle in traffic started to kind of feel like going into battle. Wasn't really enjoying that too much anymore. And just getting older and having an illness, it took a chunk out of my stamina. So then I kind of went back to drawing again. And, it was like seeing an old friend in a way. I kind of feel like an old man who's from like a small fishing village or something who, after many adventures decides to go back home.
Returns home.
Yeah, so it's kind of come full circle, and I guess I'm going to end where I began. I kind of like that. But separation of business and pleasure has always been my way. And that's kind of something I wanted to talk about, because when I listen to podcasts, I hear, at least people from the industrialized West, the notion that going pro is like the holy grail is sort of so baked into our culture that people just kind of start out with the assumption that, oh, you have to go pro. And that's great. I'm definitely not dissing that in any way. Like, if you're a professional and you enjoy being a professional and you like that and want to do that, that's great. I've been paid to draw, and I'm not saying that I won't do more of that in the future. But at least up until now, my path has always been kind of one of jealously guarding the sources of my joy. Because through my experience with music and trying to be a professional, I kind of lost the joy of music, and I never got it back. And so I don't want to lose the joy of art. It's like your well of inspiration. You got to make sure you don't contaminate it or whatever. Or at least that's the way I feel about it now,
Completely. That I just reread The War of Art, and for like, I don't know, at least a dozen times I've read that book, but it's starting to, where it used to be like a life-changing book for me, it still has like a lot of purpose, but the point where he talks about turning pro, where, the separation from amateur to pro, it bothers me. Like, it bothers me that he says that the only way to like really become like the artist you're supposed to be is to like devote 100% of your efforts to it, and to treat it like sort of like a job. And I disagree. I think that you can be a weekend warrior. You can dabble and you can find joy and fulfillment just doing the thing, not necessarily making money from it, but like just doing it for the love of doing it, and to find out what you feel about the world, and to show the world kind of what you feel about it.
Sure. And also, I'm no James Gurney and I'm no Frank Frazetta. Somebody who does it as a profession, 40 hours or more a week, may have a better skill set. But it depends on what you're doing it for. Having virtuosos is good for society. It moves society forward, but it's not necessarily always good for the virtuoso. There are a lot of virtuosos who end up with ruined lives. So I'm really after this as a source of joy and meaning, more so than to maximize how good I can get. So there's a compromise there. Sure, there's definitely a compromise there. But our society is so rooted in Puritanism, which in Puritanism, joy is really not a thing, and also in capitalism. And I like capitalism. Mind you, I'm a capitalist. But I feel that over the course of time, capitalism has gone from a means to an end to the end in itself. And it's gone from like being a way of measuring the health of the economy to measuring, human well-being and the success of everything. Right. So I want to put that back in its place a little bit, because I feel like it's gotten to the point where like the language of materialism is the only vocabulary we have to express appreciation. Like, people, when they want to say, I appreciate your work, they say, you should be a professional, because that's the only vocabulary they really have for expressing that. And when a young person like really means to say, I want to live a creative life, lacking the vocabulary to really articulate that. What they end up saying is, how do I make money with my art? And there's some overlap between those two things, but they're far from being identical. So the path of being a deliberate amateur is also a noble path. Don't let anybody make you feel bad for doing that.
So what should the vocabulary be then when somebody says that they appreciate your art?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, you could just say, I really like that, or it makes me feel
Right.
like X.
Right.
Yeah, but in our culture, that's kind of not a thing. And the other sort of corollary to this is, if there's this implicit assumption that Nirvana is going pro, then it also follows that you need to have this large Facebook following or Instagram following. And again, if you want to do that and you like doing that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I don't want people to feel like they have to have their self-esteem and self-worth kind of tied up in how many social media followers do I have. Like, I don't want people to feel bad if they don't have as many as they would like to have. Because the bottom line is, do you know about Joshua Bell, the violinist, when he was playing in the subway?
No.
Well, Joshua Bell, I may not get all the details of this story quite, 100% correct, but Joshua Bell is one of the best violinists in the world right now. And he did a social experiment where he was playing in the subway just to see, like, if anybody would stop or whatever. And basically nobody stopped for him except one 12-year-old boy, who I guess is still in the habit of making his own judgments, and he hasn't had that beaten out of him yet.
Yay, 12-year-old boy.
But everybody else just walked right on by, and these are the same people that would pay, $200 a ticket or whatever to hear him in Carnegie Hall. So the point I'm trying to make is that people aren't really all that discriminating. They don't decide for themselves what to like. Most people wait for some critical mass of their friends to decide that they like something, and then they'll go, oh, well, maybe I should check that out too. And at any given time, most people are watching cat videos on the internet. So it's like, who are these people and how much does their approval really mean to you? It's like, you can't let your self-esteem and self-worth as a human being get wrapped up in how many people click this little like button on some social media app. But you have to choose your brain trust very carefully. It's like there should be certain people you choose whose opinions matter to you. And you have to be very careful about whose opinions you allow to affect you, internally.
Right. Yeah. And it kind of makes sense. Like, I remember, who is that guy that wears the crazy hats and he's all about picking up women? Like, he's like a pickup artist.
Mystery.
Yeah. I remember watching a video about him talking about predetermination, and it's like the idea, at least, okay, well, I might not necessarily agree with this, but with picking up women, if somebody sees you with another woman, it's like that has made a decision in their brain that somebody else has already gone through the hard process of vetting you as a good guy or a bad guy,
right,
or a worthwhile mate or not. And then that makes their decision easier. There is, I think, something to that, or at least something to that in the world that we live in with social media. I know when I'm going through, say I'm searching for something on YouTube, there'll be tons of results because everybody's making videos about everything, which is great. But in order to weed it out for myself, usually YouTube does a good job of kind of ranking them appropriately. But I'll also look through the top 5, and I'll pick the channel that has the most subscribers, the most authority. So I think there is something kind of hardwired into us to sort of have that predetermination, to pick what other people have already agreed upon is good art. So that kind of makes sense. The subway story that all right, well, no, there's not a crowd of people standing around this guy, so maybe he's not a great violin player. So much of our decisions is determined on what other people think. So how do you get through that then as, a quote unquote intentional amateur, or not necessarily an intentional amateur, but somebody that has decided to not go pro? How do you sort of battle that fight?
Well, I mean, I kind of don't battle that fight. I have a certain circle of people whose opinions matter to me, and I've selected those people. And those are the people whose guidance I'm really seeking. So in order to be an intentional amateur, I'm lucky in a lot of ways, man. I have a lot of privileges, and I some of them are earned and some of them are not earned. Some of it's skill and some of it's luck, and I recognize that not everybody can or should or wants to do what I'm doing. But I just kind of want to present it out there as an option that exists for people who may be younger, and this notion that you have to become a pro is like baked into your bones because of the culture that you come from. And it's totally fine to go that way. And I just want to present, though, that there are other options and they're fine too. But one of the lovely things about contract engineering is it gives you some control over how much of your time you choose to spend on income generation. So in the past, I used to kind of, like I said, I used to set up my gigs so that the job would be over by the spring. Now I'm working on a job that seems to be going on for quite a while. It doesn't really seem to be coming to an end. So I kind of negotiated that I wanted to go down to 4 days a week so I can reclaim some more of my time, and give up some money to get some time. But having some control, I mean, if you've decided that your work is going to be about work, it's really helpful to be in a field where you have some control over how much time you choose to devote to that. So you can keep some of the other time to yourself. And during the portion of the year when I was, working a 6-month gig in contract engineering, when you're cranking. Like if they're hiring a contractor, they need it done yesterday. So you're on it like full time, if not more. So during that half of the year, I didn't want to stop creating. So what I would do is get up at 4 a.m. and get some art done from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock before breakfast. And that way, the thing that I want to get done for myself gets done first. Like no matter what else happens today, the thing I wanted to do is done. And of course, that means you're pretty much crashed out by 9 o'clock at night. But, as a 50-year-old man, what am I going to be doing at 9 o'clock at night, right? Like nothing too exciting, like probably watching TV before I go to bed or whatever. So it's not too much of a sacrifice to give that up. And a lot of people are morning people, and they say, I really can't get up early. And for a lot of people, that's true. But some people may have never tried it. If you do give it a try, you may be surprised to learn that you do much better work in the morning than you think you would. If you try it and it doesn't work for you, by all means, don't carry on doing it. But it's something that's certainly worth a try. And one of the big things to be successful at that is to lay out everything you need the night before. Because when you get up at 4 a.m, it's like you're all confused and like a headless chicken going like, oh, where's my eraser? I can't find my favorite pencil, shit. So it's like take the thing that you want to work on and put it on the drafting table the night before, lay out all the tools you're going to need, like lay out the clothes that you're going to wear. If you want to have a glass of cold water, put a bottle of that on the table too, and just make sure you have everything you need to get up the next morning and really hit it. And if you actually spend 2 hours every morning, like, not faffing around, not chewing your nails, but actually doing stuff, like you'd be amazed how much stuff you'll crank out. I was actually more productive then than I am now, if you want to know the truth. I probably have to get back to doing that.
First of all, what are some reasons that you think you're slipping?
Well, I guess there's this tendency to use all the time that you have. It's like when you have too much time, then the stuff that you do tends to start taking longer and longer.
Yeah.
Being off of work 6 months a year was not optimal, actually. If I had my druthers, it would have been much better to work like 3 days a week rather than work half a year. But that's not really the way the industry is set up. Like a project is at least 6 months long and they need you there until the project is done. But it's like during the time of the year I had off, it's like it seemed like I was self-motivated for like the first 3 months. And then it was like I had some flywheel inside me that would start losing momentum, slowing down. And then it would start taking a half hour to brush my teeth and like another hour to make a cup of coffee. It's like I'd get the way I remember my grandfather used to be when he was retired. Like, oh, I'm busy today. I need to buy a pair of pants, If you need me to do something else, I got to do that tomorrow. I'm busy today, with the pants thing.
I got a trip to JCPenney ahead of me.
Yeah, and my girlfriend would be like, "You have to get your ass back to work. Like, I can't get you to do anything."
This is something that resonates with me because I have gone in cycles as like a night owl. It's all based on the story that I've told myself that that's like when I'm most creative. But that's not necessarily true. That's just like typically that's just like when I finally, at least for a long time, got past all of the kind of resistances, all like the laziness and all dragging my feet to actually get to work is like midnight and then like put in some work, and it just happens to be the only time that I'm creating. So then I would call myself a creative person at night. Then I tried the miracle morning or the morning miracle, and that sucked at first. It was really tough to do, but then when I got in a rhythm of it, it like really changed everything. And being able to like have that creative work done in the beginning of the day made the entire rest of the day when I wasn't, when I was at my job or when I was doing other stuff, like I didn't feel guilty and I didn't feel bad and I didn't think about it all because I felt that sense of accomplishment. So my advice to people, I definitely agree with you that like it's not for everybody, but it also might not be for anybody at first. Like you might need to give it like a solid week or 2 weeks just to like force yourself to do it. Maybe even like taper onto it, like wake up half an hour earlier tomorrow, half an hour earlier than that the next day, and like get into that rhythm and build on the momentum of the accomplishment that you can get done in the beginning of your day, and also incorporate all the other stuff that you want to incorporate into your life, like your meditation if you want to do that, exercise, do all of that, and it will definitely have the cascade effect to the rest of your day.
Yeah, and if you give it the old college try and it doesn't work, I mean, by all means, try something else,
Right, don't feel shame.
Right. It's like not everybody, I'm not the Holy Grail or anything. Not everybody can or should be like me, but it's definitely worth the old college try. And if you are ever in the privileged, lucky, and extremely fortunate position of having, too much time on your hands, that's really a blessed position to be in. It's not necessarily a bad thing to give yourself stuff that you need to provide for other people by a deadline as a way of keeping that flywheel turning. I mean, like I said, I'm not opposed to making money in some kind of philosophical way. I mean, I have been paid to draw. I have sold artwork. It's just that I feel for myself that when I'm not dependent on that to make it to the end of the month, then I have the freedom to say, oh, I don't really want to draw that, or I don't really want to do that thing. I think my personality kind of clashes with this guy. And I think the freedom to do that for me is very important, to kind of hang on to my source of joy and not let the same thing that happened to my music happen to my art.
Right. You don't want it to turn into that shitty job that doesn't pay anything.
Yeah, pretty much. And at least for my own case, I mean, I say this again as being a very blessed, fortunate person who, makes a good wage. But if you sit down and do the math, I mean, if I were to go pro, I would definitely have to take all the time that I currently spend working and spend that doing social media promotion. And I don't know that I would enjoy that anymore, and I'm sure it would pay less. So for me, I'm in the fortunate position where going pro with my art is not even a sensible thing for me to do right now. Not to say it'll always be like that, If I get like pushed out of the industry or like too old to find another job or whatever, I might be singing a different tune. But at least for the time being, that's what works for me.
And then how do you make the determination? Like have you suffered from other resistances? Like you said, I don't really feel like drawing that. So how do you make the determination between, not wanting to draw that because you don't want it to turn into that shitty job that doesn't pay anything versus like laziness or procrastination or maybe fear of, pushing a style or trying something new? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I haven't really been, since I don't really solicit work, the only artwork that I get is from people who know me. I haven't really been in that position of somebody saying, hey, I want you to draw this thing, and me going, well, I really want to do that, but I'm kind of afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really address that. That hasn't really happened to me. But what has happened to me and happens to everybody, I think, is when you're just not feeling inspired. It's like you get up at 4 a.m. and there's all your tools, and it's like, I don't feel inspired. And what I do about that, at least for myself, if I give in to that, then the lazy part of my brain is going to latch onto that as a tactic and say, okay, every time Mr. Lazy, doesn't feel like doing anything, I'm just going to turn off the inspiration tap and make you not feel inspired. But in drawing, there's like a lot of stuff that needs doing that doesn't really need any inspiration. You could be filling sketchbooks with figure studies. You need to learn how to draw the human figure. You could be drawing hands. Like, that's a problem spot for every artist. Hands are hard to draw. You could be filling up studies or sketchbooks full of studies with the folds and wrinkles in clothing and how that behaves in light. That's another problem spot for every artist. Studying anatomy, studying perspective drafting. It's like all these things are things that need doing, and none of them need inspiration. So on days when I'm not really feeling inspired, I just, shift gears and work on stuff like that.
Do you save that stuff for those opportunities, or does that not come often enough that you need to sort of store that stuff for the days that you're not feeling inspired?
Well, at least for me, I think not feeling inspired is what happens the most often. So yeah, finding times when I don't feel inspired and I need to do more anatomy studies is not a problem. I think for most people, the struggle is trying to get more inspiration. I mean, I'd be surprised if you find anybody who goes, I'm so inspired all the time. It's just like having lightning up my ass. Like, I can't find time to do the mundane stuff. Yeah. If there is a guy like that, that guy is blessed. That's wonderful. It's a high quality problem.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, is there an analog to this, to other arts? I guess there must be. I mean, if you're a writer, which you are, I mean, there's probably a lot of, polishing up your English, studying grammar. I don't know. I totally don't want to come off like some guy with the old, gray beard at the top of the mountain, like some pretentious bastard here saying, well, your way of life is wrong and your culture sucks and let me tell you what to do. Like, totally not saying that. It's like, I really want to emphasize all I'm trying to do here is that, if you decide to follow this lesser traveled path that your culture doesn't necessarily promote, like, that's totally fine. And I just don't want people to feel bad about themselves, because the culture is not supporting them.
Right. Well, and when we talked before, you mentioned that you sort of do things opposite everybody else. And we sort of got into that with what we're talking about with, intentionally being an amateur, intentionally going that path. Are there other ways that you kind of consider yourself opposite other artists or opposite other creative people?
Well, I mean, the whole way that I live is so contrary to the culture. Like working these on-again, off-again jobs is very contrary to the way our culture works. Not identifying yourself primarily with your job is very contrary to the way our culture works. For years, when I used to go to house parties or whatever, what's the first question anybody asks you when they meet you for the first time? They say,
"What do you do, Johnny?"
What do you do? And
yeah.
I would answer the question that I wanted to answer instead of the one they asked. I would say, oh, you mean for fun? Well, let me tell you about this. I just got back from a motorcycle road trip and I longboard and, what do you do for fun? And they'd kind of stare at me blankly. Mm-hmm. It's like so alien not to identify yourself. But I would really advise people like not to have your self-esteem like wrapped up in your job. Because big layoffs happen. And suddenly, yesterday you were the executive vice president of Umpity Schmumpity, and now you're nothing. And it's not due to any fault of your own. It's just the cycles of business, the machinations of industry, and people are devastated when this happens. Like, some people feel terrible about themselves. Like, some people don't know who they are anymore if they're not the vice president of Umpity Schmumpity. So I would really like people not to feel that way, but to have their self-worth, based in something a little more solid.
Well, that I completely agree with you too. It's one of those tough things where people might not understand that, but I always try to, in the same scenario, I hate talking about working at the casino. I hate talking about being a poker dealer, and I have 0% of my identity wrapped up in that. In fact, I try to like kind of shy away from that sort of aspect of my life. And over the years too, with like podcasting and writing, it's like I have found so much more about myself from doing this, that so much more of my identity is wrapped up in the podcast. And then at the same time, then I'm afraid of talking about being a podcaster too, because then I get all sweaty. I get all nervous talking about it, because I do still, 4 or 5 years later, still feel like a fraud. I still feel like an imposter. So it's one of those like interesting balances to walk, where you might not self-identify with the job you do, and you might identify much greater with the thing that you do for fun, or the other aspects of your life. But it's trying to, I guess, practice. I don't know, like trying to be comfortable with the thing that you do for fun, with the thing that brings you that fulfillment, or the thing that you feel brings out your identity, your true identity even more. And then I do like your idea of saying, what do you do for fun? Like trying to completely shift the narrative and sort of take them out of their element.
Yeah, like force feeding people the red pill or something. I don't know.
Yes. Force feed people the red pill. That is going to be the title of the episode. But I think it's almost necessary in the world we live in.
I mean, also something, that I want to be clear about is another area where I'm fortunate and blessed is the thing that I do for a living is a great gig. I mean, they're good to me. They treat me well. I can kind of dictate my own hours. We're well paid. We're respected. I have no aspirations to leave it. And, it's like I'm really lucky. When I'm working the job, though, the job isn't about me having fun or me solving my problems. It's about solving the client's problems. I'm not in that equation. So work is work. And that's why I have to keep those two things separate. And I think keeping those two things separate makes me better employee, actually. Because when I am working, I'm 100% focused on solving your problems, not mine. And I realize that like some percentage of every job is going to be making license plates. Like it's not all going to be fun. But then when it's me time,
Right. No, that makes sense. Well, now talking about your art itself, you describe your art as post-apocalyptic landscape cartooning. So can you explain your style and also how you've honed in on it?
Yeah, this is another way of where I'm kind of doing maybe not the opposite of everyone else. That's the wrong term, but something nobody else really knows what to make of, and I'm not sure I do either.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of started out, my first sort of exposure to art as a kid was sort of turn of the previous century editorial cartoonists like Thomas Nast, with all that like really intricate, pen and ink work from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then Mad Magazine from the 70s, all those guys who were amazing, Mort Drucker and them. And then the 60s underground cartoonists, Robert Crumb, Gilbert Shelton. So all this like pen and ink stuff, sort of cartoonish, comic booky, and then on to Ralph Steadman. So it's like more pen and ink stuff. And I actually started out drawing comics and spent, some years drawing comics and finished a graphic novel and kickstarted that. But then with comics, again, it kind of got to the point where it was sort of feeling like a job. And then the other point of frustration that I was hitting with it was I just couldn't really draw fast enough. So everything in comics became about cutting corners to try to go faster. It's like I could never spend enough time on an image to make it, really look the way I wanted it to look. Everything's faster, 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 and that got frustrating too. And there are some people who draw really fast, and like every panel, looks like an oil painting, and they can do a whole book like that. And that's incredible. I don't know how those people do it, but I can't.
They're aliens.
yeah, they're aliens. But yeah, I can't do it. So I kind of decided it was time for me to move on from that and got really interested in urban sketching. And urban sketching, they used to call that plein air painting, 100 years ago, and now they call it urban sketching. It's basically the same thing where you go out and draw on location. And, kind of like motorcycling, that has this really compelling experiential component that grinding out pages for a comic book didn't really have for me. It's like you're out in the world, you're out in the fresh air, you're usually out there with other people, you're drawing something that's really there. But then I would tend to, kind of choose subjects that looked really post-apocalyptic, kind of, Blade Runner-ish. And then fantasy elements started like creeping into all of these things I was drawing. It's like I started drawing it the way it like might look after World War III, or, the way it might look 1,000 years after human civilization is gone. A part of this was kind of my father died of Parkinson's disease. I guess it's now a bit more than a year ago, last spring.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's a really cruel disease, and it's this terrible, like, degenerative thing where, the patient just slowly deteriorates, over a long period of time. And I think I kind of latched on to themes of decay, deterioration as sort of like a metaphor for what was happening to my father. But then at some point, something else happened where it's like you never really look at something the way you look at it when you have to draw it. When you have to draw something, you're really sitting down and looking at it. And if you really look at like filthy and broken concrete or broken glass or rusty metal, things that are falling apart, things that are tilting over, and really look at like the colors and the textures and the way it interacts with light, there's beauty there. And it's kind of the beauty that nobody sees. It's the beauty that's hidden in plain sight. So I became kind of captivated with that beauty. It's like man-made objects don't really start to acquire character until they start decaying and entropy takes over and they start falling down, leaning over. Who wants to draw a shopping mall,
James Gurney.
James Gurney. Oh my God, that guy is fantastic. Oh God. How does he do it? He's one of these aliens I talk about who can like fill an entire book where every page is just perfect. Yeah. Wow. How does he do it?
Yeah, he's great. Well, now was it like an aha moment? The realization that, like you said, like the beauty doesn't start to come to man-made objects until they start falling apart. Did that come as like this big realization and then you honed in on it, or is that something that just naturally started to seep into your art?
It crept into it slowly, and then at some point it did get over the threshold of my consciousness. Mm-hmm. I became aware of it. But yeah, it is the kind of thing that came on slowly. And it's like for a while, I was drawing cockroaches from, enlarged photos. Because if you can like stare at a blow up photo of a cockroach like long enough to get over your revulsion, which I admit it takes a long time to do that. But if you can do that, eventually you'll come to an appreciation for what an incredible machine it is. Mm-hmm. Just the power and the elegance of its design, Maybe I shouldn't say design because I don't really believe in conscious design, but, use that as a metaphor. Just the engineering of its construction is so impressive. There's beauty even in that. So at some point I became conscious of the fact that the world is filled with, beauty that's not landscapes and sunsets and fields of flowers, but beauty is hidden in all kinds of things.
That's an incredible realization to have.
It was, but then I don't know how to paint. And I thought, okay, so I'm already 50 years old. It's like, even if I were 20, becoming like James Gurney is probably not a possibility. It's like at the age of 50, I definitely don't have enough runway in front of me.
I disagree, but go ahead. Go ahead.
So I had another idea, which was, so how can we cut some time off the learning curve? And this might be relevant for some people too. The first thing was when you ask people, how do I learn how to paint? What artists will typically tell you is, well, I've been painting for 20 years, and if you just kind of dork around with it for 20 years, then you'll develop a feel for it, and then you'll know how to paint like me. I was like, man, I don't have 20 years to dork around with it. It's like I need a map of the territory. And being analytical really cuts the time off the learning curve. And James Gurney's book, Color and Light, presents a very analytical approach to color theory. And if you can be, having a mathematical background helps with this. But if you can be the kind of person where you really understand like the rules and you know why you're making decisions and you know why you're doing everything that you're doing, you can kind of home in on it very quickly, much more quickly than if you just hunt and peck and try to navigate with your sense of smell. And then the other big thing is I narrowed the scope of what I was trying to do. So I figured, okay, so I can't be like James, it's just not in the cards. But if I pick like one or two things, can I learn to do those one or two things like as well as James does them? Well, probably yes. And if I pick those one or two things very carefully, can I get a lot of mileage out of those one or two things? And the answer again is probably yes. So the thing that I decided to do was start watercoloring my ink drawings because it's a much smaller step from what I already know how to do. And when you're watercoloring a drawing, like you're doing a lot less with the color. You're doing most of the heavy lifting with the drawing. So, you don't really need to be a painter. And the end result is, just as enjoyable to people. It's like I haven't had anybody say, I really like looking at that, but God, I would have enjoyed it so much more if only the ink weren't there. Right? So, it's a very clever hack. It makes an end result that's just as enjoyable. And, I can get there from here in a reasonable amount of time. And it's by narrowing the scope.
Right. And it's also developing your own style for, even by accident, not by accident, but developing your own style by taking the one or two things from James Gurney that you can really focus in on and master, and doing that with all the artists that you love or all of the influences that you have, and then kind of meshing it into a style that works for you. I didn't even really notice how you did color until I'm looking now, until you told that story. You know what I mean? So it's like trusting yourself to pick and choose those things that you can master. Maybe 50 isn't too old to be able to, if you kept going and taking each and every one of James Gurney's aspects and continue to work on them, maybe you could become James Gurney, but you don't want to become James Gurney. You want to become Jonny Bloozit,
Yeah, well, that's a whole other issue, the issue of imitating other people. But I figured if the breadth of what I was trying to do was too broad, then I wouldn't get enough depth. So it's like the way to get more depth is by narrowing the breadth. And so I really narrowed what I was trying to do in order to get further with it. But as far as style goes, I've come to the belief that your own style is going to come out like it or not. Everything you draw is going to look like you drew it. You can't prevent it. So it's really best to try to avoid thinking about style altogether. Like, it's an issue that's unworthy of your attention. The only problems that are worthy of your attention are the fundamental problems, the problems of light, shadow, texture, form, volume, anatomy, perspective. Just concentrate on the fundamentals and the style will take care of itself.
I feel that like for young artists, that's like a hard thing to grasp, or it's something that they have to experience themselves for years, and it's almost like they can't see that until it's in hindsight. The fact that you almost have to ignore the trying to hone your style. Do you have any advice for getting past that mental shift of, well, I got to figure out my style, or I can't, I'm imitating this artist, but I can't be exactly like them, and all of the other kind of thoughts that go into your head as you are trying to become the artist you're supposed to become?
Well, a couple of books that helped me a lot, and this is, purely as a satisfied customer. I don't get any kickbacks from these books or anything like that. But Color and Light I already mentioned. But Andrew Loomis has a book called Figure Drawing for All It's Worth. And Loomis was a commercial illustrator instructor whose heyday was in the 30s and 40s, I think. So it's a pretty old book. But the great thing about Loomis is that Loomis doesn't have any talent either. He's kind of like me. Everything he's achieved has been through working on it. He wasn't born with anything. And so he's also very analytical. And he really breaks it down to drafting, how you draw the human figure, how you construct it. And his method requires practice, but it doesn't require that you be born with any special aptitudes or talents. Like, you just have to work on it. And so that's a really good book to like nail down the fundamentals of drafting. And another book that I like is called Perspective for Comic Book Artists by David Chelsea. And that book itself is drawn as a comic book, and that's a great book for learning perspective. And the reason I like that book is because most perspective books that are out there tend to be either written for architects, so they're way too mathematical, or they're written for fine artists and they're not technical enough. They assume you're going to be working from life all the time and you just need like a peripheral familiarity with the subject. But David Chelsea's book kind of walks the nice middle path between those two extremes. Because as an artist, you're more like a movie director. Like, it doesn't have to be mathematically accurate. It just has to be a set piece that looks good in the shot. So it has to be technical to a degree, but it doesn't have to be like mathematically perfect. And his book is a great book for that. And the reason why I like really having your perspective drafting down is because, first of all, if you don't have great spatial perception, and I don't, even when you go out and draw from life, you're not going to be able to copy everything perfectly the way it is. Everything's going to come out a little bit wonky unless you bother to draw a perspective line and vanishing points, even if you freehand them. And the other reason why I like it is because a lot of times you need to change what it is you're looking at. Like the angle that you really want to draw it from would have you standing in the middle of the street. So it's like you want to use the thing that you're looking at as reference, but it's like you want to change the angle. You want to change stuff about it. And in order to have the tools to be able to change anything, you need to really know your drafting. So I would say, especially for an urban sketcher, it's like however much time you were planning on spending on perspective drafting, like multiply that by 5. Really get that down. Yeah. Because the amount of time that you're going to spend faffing around, like trying to fix all of the things that go wonky that, wouldn't have done if only you'd bothered to draw a horizon line, is going to waste so much more time than just knuckling down and learning it, and it's not really that hard.
Do you have any other resources that you think would help people listening?
Well, getting back to what I was saying before about having people whose opinions you value, it's really nice if you can get a critique group together, especially of people who are a little further down the road than you are. Because people who are sort of at the same point that you are often not going to be able to point out the things that you could be doing better. And, you got to make sure that it's not an ego-stroking group, but that it's actually a critique group. I actually had a critique group that the group was called Your Drawing Sucks. That was the name of the group.
Nice.
Because I wanted to make it very clear, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. Like, this is a critique group. You're here to find out what you're doing wrong. But that helps a lot. Like, if you can have people who are accomplished, like, point out the mistakes that you're making, the things that you could be doing better. And learning the rules is really kind of important. And here's the thing. In music and in art, a lot of people chafe against learning the rules because they think it's like some guy with a long beard coming down from the mountain telling you like what you are or are not allowed to do according to the rules of music. But don't look at it that way. Like, the rules are more like the rules of the Matrix. Like, once you know them, some can be bent and others can be broken. But you have to know that they're there, and you have to know which rules you're breaking and why. Like, you can't bullshit your way into being Salvador Dali by not learning perspective. Like, anybody with eyeballs can see the difference in 2 seconds. It just doesn't work. So the rules are kind of like, I picture it like a mountain that's got a flat top. So if you're like within the rules, you're on the flat top of the mountain and everything is safe, and no matter what you do, you can't really hurt yourself because you're within the rules. And then when you start to push the boundaries, you're on like the steep slopes of the mountain. And I'm not saying you should never go there. That's where all the excitement is. But it's like you have to be aware that you're there, and you have to be somewhat careful, not to go tumbling down the mountain. And the only way to do that is like you need a map of the flat top, and you need to know where its edges and boundaries are. It's like some blind guy who just goes blundering around who has no idea where the edge of the mountain is just going to fall off.
Right. Got to find your footing.
Yeah. So some of these books will really give you like a good grounding in the rules, which will give you a good solid base. And like, don't look at that as somebody restricting you. That's not what it is.
And would you have any advice for, in terms of the critique group, to convince somebody that's ahead of you on the path to be a part of that, that it would be like worth their time? Like, how did you sort of get your group together? Was it just creating it and then just putting it out on Facebook, or like how did that work?
Well, Boston is pretty vibrant. So there are a bunch of like live groups around here, a bunch of comics groups and a bunch of urban sketching groups that have an online presence. And also, at least before the pandemic, they had a presence in the real world. So I just kind of used the contacts in those groups and said, hey, who wants to start a critique group? And we didn't necessarily have any, James Gurneys or any rock stars in the group, but you don't necessarily need to either. I mean, if someone is a little bit further down, just a little bit further down the path than you are, they have stuff to teach you. And people also might be better at different things. It's like somebody might have anatomy on lockdown, but then you might be a little bit better at color theory than they are, or better at perspective. So it's not like a video game where it's like, oh, I'm on level 10 and too bad, you peon, you're only on level 3. It's, it's not like your level is this scalar number or anything like that.
Right. That makes sense. All right, Jonny, it is time for the final push, and that's where I ask you to reach through the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today and just give them your best final words of advice and push them to pursue their own creative passions.
Well, I don't know what I can say to really force somebody forward, but maybe I can kind of remove some of the blockages that are preventing you going forward. And I would just say, like in some churches, they say, don't let the devil steal your joy. And so that's what I'll say is do this for you and make it a source of joy and make it a source of happiness. And don't let people make you feel bad that you're not achieving as much as they think you should be achieving, or you're not doing what they think you should be doing. This is your little well, tend it.
Perfect. I love it. Jonny, thank you so much for reaching out, for coming on the show, sharing your story, and giving us all that kind of encouragement that we don't need to necessarily go pro. We can be a completely content and happy amateur, and we can make that decision for ourselves. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. And, I'm a junkie of your show, and I look forward to many more years of junkiehood.
Yeah. I look forward to filling your habit.
Awesome.
And for everybody listening, you can find out more about Jonny, check out his work at bloozit.com, BLOOZIT.com. And we'll have everything linked up at today's show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/365. Jonny, thanks again.
Be well, my friend.
Huge thank you to Jonny once again for coming on the show. One big major takeaway from this episode, and I think you probably might know what it is. It's the idea of being okay with being an intentional amateur. Because let's face it, even if you decide to go professional as an artist, as a creative person, there is going to be a long period of time where you're not generating revenue, where you're not having money come in. And that's why it's so incredibly important to love the thing you do and to choose a creative output, to choose an art form that you would do for the rest of your life, regardless of whether you made a cent from it. But that notion aside, it's okay to make the decision to never make a cent from your art as well. There is no shame in having something separate, something completely non-creative that you do for a living to pay the bills. That's what I do. That's what so many of my guests before have done, even if they did later have a change of heart and decide to try to go full-time doing their art. Being an artist, being a creative person, being able to express yourself, being able to figure out your place in the world through your creative output is, in my opinion, the most valuable thing in life. So above all else, guard and protect that joy that you have for the thing that you do. And if you find yourself straying from that joy, find your way back to it as quickly as you possibly can so that you don't permanently lose that joy for that thing that you love. On our next episode, we have Carla Grace. Carla is a self-taught wildlife artist who was born in South Africa and currently lives in Australia. If you want to check out her work, you can head to carlagraceart.com, or on Instagram, she is Carla_Grace_art, or we'll have that all linked up at today's show notes page, along with everything we talked about with Jonny at yourcreativepush.com/364. But that's all I've got for you today, so hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done, so go and get it done. It is good to be back from my little hiatus. I've got some amazing episodes in the pipeline for you, some great conversations that I've already had, and some great conversations that I'm about to have. So make sure you stay tuned to your feed. I love you all so much, and remember that the universe needs your creations, and you are the universe. We'll see you next time. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to subscribe to YCP on your favorite podcast app. Or better yet, join the newsletter, where you'll get each week's episode, YouTube video, inspirational resources, and a sneak peek at the following week's guest, all in one weekly email. Again, that's yourcreativepush.com/subscribe.